The hull of final petition hung above the night side of Kepri Prime like a shard of frozen lightning. 300 floors of white alloy and black glass rose from the center of the judicial ring, each level rotating at a different speed so that from orbit the entire structure looked like a machine built to grind certainty into law. Every species in the Concord knew the shape of that building. Every trader, every admiral, every governor, every refugee who still believed procedure could be kinder than war knew what it meant to stand before the 9 benches of interstellar judgment. Inside those walls, empires had been disassembled with signatures. Markets had collapsed because a clerk moved one line of text. Whole species had been declared protected, quarantined, sanctioned, or forgotten. Law lived there. Or at least the galaxy liked to pretend it did. On the morning the humans came to submit the black box, the hall was full before first light touched the eastern edge of the planet below. Delegations packed the galleries in concentric terraces that wrapped the chamber like the inside of an enormous shell. Floating pods held aquatic observers suspended in nutrient mist. Gravlocked balconies supported the heavier delegations from high-gravity worlds. Translators shimmered in the air like beads of glass. Every whisper became text in 100 languages. Every movement was recorded. Every expression was tagged, archived, and sold before the hearing even began. At the center of the chamber, under a canopy of suspended legal sigils and rotating treaty seals, stood the petitioner's platform. It was smaller than the prosecution dais. It always was. The Concord liked symbolism. It liked to remind the desperate that they stood on less ground than the powerful. Advocate Miriam Vale stood alone on that smaller platform. She wore no ceremonial robe, no chain of office, no decorative family crest. Her suit was dark charcoal, cut with the clean severity of military tailoring but stripped of all insignia except one small silver bar at the collar that marked her as a representative of the Soul Relief Commission. Her hair was bound tightly at the back of her head. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the console before her. Her expression gave away nothing. Directly opposite her, reclining in layered seats of obsidian composite, the 9 benches looked down. Chief Arbiter Soreth of the Ilax Combined sat at the center. He was long-limbed, pale, and nearly translucent, with a crest of nerve filaments fanned behind his head like a crown of frozen roots. Ilax judges were famous for detachment. They claimed emotion interfered with clarity. To most species, that detachment looked uncomfortably close to contempt. To his left sat Prelate Joran of the vast tribune, broad as a cargo loader, skin plated in overlapping bronze ridges, eyes half-lidded with boredom. Next to him perched Magistrate Helle, avian and elegant, her gold feathers polished to mirror brightness. The others ranged across the bench in a study of power curated into legality. Old species. Rich species. Species whose shipping lanes had names. Species that wrote the rules because they had survived long enough to make their survival sound like wisdom. Behind Miriam Vale, in the observer rows assigned to petitioners, sat no cheering delegation. No human gallery full of murmuring diplomats. No dramatic display of solidarity. There were only 8 people. A doctor in plain white carrying a sealed data case on his knees. A navigation officer with scar tissue across one side of her face. A gray-haired woman from the Refugee Ministry. 2 children from different species wearing translation bands and formal shoes far too new for their feet. A liaison from the Scythian free ports. An old man from the Rin monasteries. And Captain Elias Mercer, retired civilian command, who stood because if he sat for too long his reconstructed spine locked and hurt. Across the chamber, the Carrid Dominion delegation occupied an entire crescent tier. They had arrived in armor. Not battle armor. Something more insulting. Dress armor. Crimson plates over ceremonial black mesh, each shoulder etched with scenes of conquest. At their center stood Dominion Minister Varkesh, tall even for his species, horned, scaled, and surrounded by aides who handled his tablets, his water vessel, his records, and the train of dark fabric that spilled from his back plates like a captured flag. He had already spoken to 6 news drones before the hearing began. He had smiled in all 6 interviews. Because he believed he had already won. The case before the 9 benches had been formally catalogued as Petition 44-981A, Sole Relief Commission vs. Dominion Border Command, concerning the destruction of refugee transport Dawn's Mercy in the Pelagos Transit Corridor, loss of civilian life, and denial of protected passage under Articles 7, 9, and 14 of the Concord Refugee Statutes. That was the legal phrasing. The Galaxy had given it a different name. The human crying case. Because that was how the first week of coverage had framed it. A human petition about a lost ship. Human survivors demanding accountability. Human aid workers speaking of children, medics, evacuees, sealed cryobays, emergency beacons, and civilian corridors. Many found it distasteful. Many found it theatrical. Quite a few found it predictable. The Dominion insisted Dawn's Mercy had been an unregistered smuggling vessel moving contraband and military-age human males through a contested lane under false civilian codes. They claimed it had failed to respond to lawful orders, altered course toward a patrol cruiser, and been destroyed during necessary interdiction after its reactor destabilized. They called it a regrettable incident made unfortunate by human talent for emotional propaganda. The Concord press had loved that phrase. Emotional propaganda. It fit neatly with what older species like to say about humanity. Too young. Too intense. Too attached to individual suffering. Too likely to elevate anecdote over system. Humans built excellent ships, effective hospitals, and dangerous armies, but whenever grief entered the room they forgot scale. They forgot structure. They forgot that civilization was, above all things, the art of accepting that some losses could be categorized and then moved past. That morning everyone expected Miriam Vale to fail with dignity. The chamber gong sounded once. A deep, resonant note rolled through the hall and quieted every translation stream. Chief Arbiter Soreth inclined his narrow head. Petition 44-981, a resumes. Advocate Miriam Vale, you requested emergency continuation after denial of your prior evidentiary motion. You were granted this appearance under protest from 6 benches and time limited to 1 substantive submission. State your purpose. Miriam touched the console. Her voice emerged calm and level, carried evenly to every tier. Earth submits the black box from Dawn's Mercy. The chamber did not explode. It froze first. Silence has levels. This one was sharp enough to cut. Then came the sound that would echo across the systems for years after. Laughter. Not from everyone. Not even from most. But enough. Enough to stain the room. Minister Varkesh threw his head back and let out a bark of amusement that flashed his rows of polished teeth. Magistrate Heliai's beak clicked open in visible disbelief. Prelate Joran gave a low rumble that might once have been a soldier's laugh before it became a judge's dismissal. Higher in the public galleries, commentators leaned toward one another with delight. Feeds lit up. A wave of private messages crossed the live networks. Some species did not understand why it was funny, but they understood power, and they imitated the reaction of those who held it. Chief Arbiter Soreth did not laugh. That would have been beneath him. His face merely arranged itself into a patience so thin it became cruelty. The vessel was destroyed, he said. Completely, by every recovered survey. Your own filings affirmed catastrophic hull failure and reactor bloom. Correct, Miriam said. And yet, Soreth continued, you ask this tribunal to entertain the fantasy that an intact black box survived multivector fragmentation, plasma venting, and impact dispersion across 80,000 kilometers of debris field. I ask this tribunal, Miriam said, to receive evidence. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Soreth's nerve filaments lifted slightly behind his head. Advocate, do not mistake procedural tolerance for indulgence. This hall is not a stage for grief rituals. If you have brought symbolic debris, personal effects, or memorial media. I brought the black box. This time the silence broke differently. Not with laughter alone. With annoyance. Minister Varkesh stepped forward from his delegation tier and placed one clawed hand on his own console. The Dominion objects to this farce. We have tolerated weeks of human sentimentalism. We have answered every inquiry. We have released patrol logs, command statements, weapons telemetry, and scan records. Must the court now pretend dead metal speaks because humans are unable to accept an unfavorable ruling? Captain Mercer moved behind Miriam as if to rise, but the old gray-haired woman beside him touched his sleeve and he stilled. Miriam never turned. Dead metal speaks all the time, Minister, she said. That is why ships carry recorders. Several spectators hissed softly at the bluntness. In the carried tier, Varkesh's eyes narrowed. Sorath raised one hand. The chamber obeyed. Very well, he said. You may present your object. Let the record note that the bench maintains severe reservations as to admissibility. Miriam nodded once toward the doctor in white seated behind her. He rose, lifted the sealed case carefully with both hands, and walked to the petitioner's platform. He moved with the deliberate care of someone carrying ashes or explosives. Perhaps, in a way, he carried both. He set the case on the console. Its surface was scorched. Its corners were dented. Half the outer shell had been replaced by a lattice of clear stabilizing resin around something black and jagged inside. The chamber leaned forward. It did not look impressive. That was part of its power. No gleaming miracle. No pristine recovered artifact. Just a broken recorder housing, torn from a murdered ship, patched enough to speak. Miriam rested her fingertips on the case. Recovered from debris cluster Pelagos 9 by civilian salvage teams under sole charter, she said. Chain of custody documented. Stabilization performed under observation from independent inspectors from the Scythian Free Ports, the Rin monastic archivists, and the neutral registry of Helios Reach. Verification packets were filed 3 standard hours ago with this tribunal and mirrored to the public record. That caused the first real stir on the bench. Magistrate Heliai's head snapped toward her clerk. Mirrored? Yes, magistrate, the clerk whispered. Public release tags are valid. Varkesh's crest flattened. Under what authority? The authority, Miriam said, of anticipating obstruction. A few spectators inhaled sharply. Chief Arbiter Soratha's face hardened by one almost invisible degree. You presume much, advocate. I prepared thoroughly. Sorath let the words hang. Proceed. Miriam keyed the case open. Internal clamps released with a series of soft mechanical clicks. The top lifted. Suspended in gel cradle and magnetic frame lay the actual recording core, smaller than many had imagined, blackened along one edge, one data spine shattered and rebonded by microsuture fiber. The children in the second row behind Miriam stared at it without blinking. This, she said, is the distributed emergency memory core of Dawn's Mercy. Human-built, civilian-grade, relief-certified, impact-hardened, shielded against vacuum, radiation, and directed energy disruption. It is not a simple flight recorder. It contains synchronized bridge audio, internal corridor feeds, transponder history, distress traffic, environmental telemetry, cryobay status, medbay biometrics, external sensor logs, and command archive duplication. It also contains a deadman protocol. Varkesh folded his arms. Meaningless jargon. No, said Miriam. Meaningful engineering. That line did not sound theatrical. That was why it landed. The hull quieted again. Dawn's Mercy, she continued, carried 11,412 refugees under provisional humanitarian transport. 6,000 human. 5,412 non-human from 9 species. 1,822 minors. 316 critical care patients. 4 sealed neonatal pods. 47 medical staff. 83 volunteer crew. No shipboard heavy weapons. No marine detachment. No smuggling compartments. No military cargo. Minister Varkesh gave an exaggerated sigh. The Dominion does not contest that humans can count their dead. Miriam looked up at him for the first time. You should have. The doctor in white stepped back. Miriam placed her hand flat on the recorder core. The holofield above the petitioner's platform came alive. Not with charts. With a corridor. The image flickered, stabilized, and sharpened into the interior of Dawn's Mercy. Narrow walls. Emergency strips along the floor. Paint worn by use. A child's handprint in blue near a junction hatch. 2 medics moving a grav stretcher around a corner. No one in the chamber breathed for a moment because however they had imagined a refugee ship, this was not dramatic enough. Not noble enough. Not grand enough. It looked ordinary. That was worse. A timestamp floated in the upper corner. Pelagos Transit Corridor. 4 hours, 11 minutes before destruction. People filled the corridor. Families. Nurses. A 6-limbed Scythian grandmother wrapped around 2 sleeping grandchildren. A human boy in an oversized thermal blanket carrying a cage with some small animal inside. A Rin monk kneeling beside a woman connected to portable oxygen tubing. Over it all came the bridge announcement of Captain Lena Ortez, voice steady, practiced, tired. Approach window in 32 minutes. Refugee Groups 7 through 12 prepare document bans. Medbay staff report neonatal pod temperatures on Channel 4. Remember that no one is left in staging. If you are still searching for a family member, report to the Yellow Jackets. We will find them. The image switched. A mess deck. A volunteer serving broth. A carrot infant, horn stubs just visible above the brow, asleep against a human aid worker's shoulder. That caused a visible flinch in the Dominion delegation. The aid worker adjusted the blanket gently and kept moving. The feed switched again. Bridge. Civilian consoles. Navigation plotted in clean blue arcs. Distress corridor beacons ahead. Pelagos customs gate beyond. No weapons officer. No tactical pit. No one wearing combat gear. Then the black box overlaid external scan data. A peaceful lane. Then 3 contact lights blooming from the edge of the grid. Carried Border Command Patrol. Their ID signatures burned bright and undeniable. Varkesh lifted one hand. No one disputes our vessels performed lawful inspection. Keep watching, Miriam said. Audio channels unfolded. Dominion Patrol Leader, Unregistered Transport Dawn's Mercy, you are entering restricted customs envelope. Cut engines and prepare for boarding. Captain Ortez, Dominion Patrol, this is Civilian Refugee Transport Dawn's Mercy, Concord Provisional Status Code appended. We are in protected transit under Article 7. Forwarding medical manifest and minor registry now. There was a pause in the recording. Long enough to feel thought on the other side of it. Then another voice. Sharper. Military. Impatient. Reviewing. Hold position. The feed split. The chamber saw both sides at once. Dawn's Mercy Bridge on the left. Carried Patrol Command Deck on the right, reconstructed from sensor reflection and recovered signal scraped by the recorder's deadman protocol. Several judges shifted at that. They had expected only shipboard memory, not cross-assembled battlefield reconstruction. A carried officer leaned over his station. Human-civilian transport. Large population density. Species mix irregular. They're broadcasting refugee shield requests. Another voice, deeper, almost amused. Verify if petition seal is active. Checking. A beat. Seal pending. Varkesh turned sharply to one of his aides. The aide had gone very still. In the chamber, Miriam said nothing. The patrol commander on the right side of the Holyfield tapped a claw against his chair arm. Pending means not recognized. Order them to heave to. We'll inspect the holds. Captain Ortez on the left did not sound afraid yet. Dominion Patrol, our cryobays cannot sustain a hard stop and boarding delay. We request escorted passage to the customs gate where this may be resolved by station med-arbiters. We are carrying critical patients. The patrol commander smiled. Request denied. A child in the observer rows behind Miriam lowered his eyes. The feed jumped ahead by 6 minutes. Carried cutters had spread into flanking positions. Dawn's Mercy reduced thrust. Internal camera showed crew members strapping down equipment. Medics securing patients. Overhead, Captain Ortez's voice again, still controlled. All decks. Remain calm. We are transmitting full compliance. Parents keep minor bands visible. Cryoteams report to bays 2 and 5. Then came the first line that changed the room. A junior carried tactical officer, unaware that every syllable would one day be heard by the galaxy, asked, "Why are they still transmitting the child channels?" The commander answered without looking at him. "Because they think it matters." No one laughed now. The recording continued. Boarding clamp struck hull. Internal corridor feed showed civilians recoiling as metal groaned through the bulkheads. Human volunteers moved fast, not with panic, but with practiced disaster calm. They opened shelter alcoves. They directed families behind reinforced partitions. A medic knelt in front of the blue handprint junction and told 3 children exactly how to cover their ears if a breach alarm sounded. On the right side of the hollow, carried Marines in hard-shell armor cycled weapons. "Boarding rules?" one asked. The commander answered, "Secure bridge. Secure engine room. Any resistance, mark as insurgent behavior. Even in med sectors." A pause. Then, especially there. Smugglers hide behind weakness. Several benches shifted visibly. Prelate Joran's heavy brow lowered. Magistrate Heliai's feathers flattened along her neck. Varkesh stepped to his console again. "This is manipulated reconstruction. We object to selective edit and emotional sequencing." Miriam keyed the recorder. Metadata unfolded in the air. Timestamp signatures. Checksum chains. Independent verification seals. 3 neutral observers. Public mirrors. "The full archive is available," she said. "This is the mild version." If there had been any smugness left in the chamber, it began to die there. The holofeed showed the first boarding. Carried Marines forced open a side hatch near Supply Junction C. They entered a civilian hallway with rifles raised. Before them stood not armed men, not smugglers, not insurgents. A nurse. She had both hands lifted. One still held a portable scanner. Behind her, visible through the open med partition, were 4 grav cots and a half-assembled blood filter. "This is a medical sector," she said. "No weapons here. We have respiratory patients." The nearest Marine struck her across the face with the butt of his weapon. A sound moved through the hall. Not a word. Just breath leaving hundreds of bodies at once. The nurse hit the deck. A child screamed off camera. The Marine swung his rifle toward the sound. Captain Mercer behind Miriam closed both hands until the knuckles whitened. The feed cut to bridge audio. "Boarding parties are inside Med 5, a crewman said. They're not following corridor maps." Captain Ortez answered, "Keep channels open. Record everything. No one fire anything. No one touch the emergency lockers unless I order it. On the other side, the carried commander asked, any sign of contraband? Negative. Civilians packed to the bulkheads. Then keep looking. Commander, the tactical officer said carefully, Customs Gate just acknowledged receipt of their seal packet. The commander turned his head slowly. Did they validate it? Not yet. Then it is still pending. He did not need to say more. The boarding footage advanced. A volunteer translator trying to explain evacuation law in Karatic. A Marine shoving him into a wall. A corridor light cracking under a falling body. Parents pressing themselves over children. A Scythian elder showing both palms and repeating, in flawless trade speech, this is protected passage. Protected passage. Protected passage. Then came the second line that changed the room. A Marine asked over comms, Commander, there are non-human minors here. The reply came instantly. Then their guardians should have chosen better company. For the first time, Chief Arbiter Sorath leaned forward. Miriam let the moment hold. Let the hall feel what laughter sounded like when replayed later in memory against the voices of the doomed. Then the feed jumped ahead another 4 minutes. Captain Ortez again. No longer merely calm. Focus down to a blade edge. All decks listen to me. Boarding teams are violating protected status. Route all miners to interior shelter points. Cryobay techs, if we lose power you go manual. Repeat, you go manual. Med sectors prepare triage. We will not provoke reactor instability. We will not give them a reason. Record everything. A different voice cut in, male, breathless. Captain, they shot through med glass. Another. Bridge access team at Junction Alpha. Another. Boarders trying to seize Manifest Core. Captain Ortez said one sentence, and half the chamber would remember it more clearly than their own names. They want us guilty more than they want us searched. Silence swallowed the hall. Varkesh spoke again, but softer now. This proves confusion during a lawful interdiction. Nothing more. Miriam looked at him as if he were late to a lesson. No, she said. This proves intent. The black box has not even begun. She touched another control. The corridor footage vanished. In its place appeared a compressed data map of signal traffic between Dawn's Mercy, the Carrot Patrol, the Pelagos Customs Gate, and the judicial ring relay that served emergency refugee petitions. Every lane of data lit in color. Green for sent. Blue for received. Red for blocked. Gold for altered. The audience stared. Because now the case had changed. Emotion had become architecture. Miriam spoke into that stunned quiet. Dawn's Mercy submitted provisional refuge seals 7 hours before contact. Pelagos Customs received them. Judicial Ring Relay acknowledged them. The Carrot Patrol requested status review. At this point, under Concord law, the vessel should have been treated as protected pending denial by competent authority. A gold line pulsed between the Judicial Ring Relay and Pelagos Customs. Instead, she said, the seal priority was downgraded. Chief Arbiter Sorath's expression did not move. But one of his clerks paled. Magistrate Hellay spoke first. By whom? Miriam expanded the gold line. Routing markers unfolded. Authorization stamps appeared. One after another. The chamber saw the origin. Subchamber Review Office, Bench Liaison Network, Hall of Final Petition. This building. This court. A hiss rose like steam from 100 throats. Varkesh slammed one claw against his console. Forgery. No, Miriam said. Administrative murder. Chief Arbiter Sorath's voice cut across the noise, sharp for the first time. You will moderate your language. When this court moderates its body count. That did it. Gasps. Uproar. Translators lagged for a second under the surge. Security drones along the walls brightened from passive blue to active amber. Several judges began speaking at once. Sorath struck his gavel sphere. The concussion tone hammered through the chamber. Order. It took time. Real time. Enough to reveal fear under ceremony. When the room quieted, Miriam continued as though nothing had happened. The downgrade changed Dawn's Mercy from pending protected transit to unresolved cargo movement subject to discretionary inspection. 38 seconds later, the Carrot Patrol invoked enforcement discretion. 2 minutes later, boarding began. 10 minutes later, weapons discharge in med sectors. 17 minutes later, directed fire into cryobay compartments. 21 minutes later, structural failure. The doctor in white behind her closed his eyes briefly. Miriam activated the next file. Because the court seemed so certain a black box could not survive, I should explain the Deadman protocol. The holofield showed a schematic of the recorder core, then of a cloud of tiny emission points spread through the ship's hull. Dawn's Mercy carried distributed memory seeds in 32 locations. At catastrophic threat threshold, all channels mirrored across the seed lattice. At catastrophic breach, the system burst transmitted compressed archives to any receiving object within line-of-sight bandwidth, including debris, escorts, customs buoys, civilian comm traffic, and hostile hull reflections. That is why the black box survived. It did not survive in one place. It survived everywhere. No one moved. Humans learned this, she said, because people kept trying to erase what they did to civilians. That sentence did not rise. It did not thunder. It simply settled in the room like gravity. The next playback began without warning. No corridor. No charts. Only audio. Bridge alarms. Hull groaning. Children crying somewhere far away. Breath over microphones. Captain Ortez speaking faster now. Engine room, report. Coolant lines holding. For now. Cryobay 2. Manual handoff started. Bridge hatch integrity at 20%. Then another voice came through open carriage channel, perhaps because they no longer cared to hide it. Commander, Customs Gate just validated their protection. The answer was immediate. Too late. The chamber went cold. No one had to explain what that meant. The audio continued. A human crewman, they're painting the reactor spine. Captain Ortez, transmit on all bands. Open child channels. Open med channels. Open everything. Then Dawn's Mercy flooded the galaxy with its last lawful plea. This is civilian refugee transport Dawn's Mercy. We are under live fire. Protection status now active. We carry minors. We carry medical patients. We are non-combatant. Repeat, non-combatant. Any vessel hearing this, witness us. The words echoed across the chamber speakers. Somewhere high in the galleries a spectator made a choking sound. The response from the Carrot Patrol commander arrived 3 seconds later. Witness denied. Then weapons fire. Not the clean abstraction of tactical diagrams. Not bright icons crossing a map. Sound. Metal tearing. Bulkheads failing. Human voices trying not to scream because other people were listening. Cryobay alarms. One medic repeating manual seal counts while the deck pitched under her feet. Someone praying in a language the translators struggled to identify through static. A child asking if they were almost there. Another voice saying yes. Yes. Almost. Miriam did not look back. She let the chamber hear it. Captain Ortez one final time, voice ragged now. Record this. If anyone finds this. Tell them we stayed in the corridor. Tell them we kept the codes open. Tell them we never armed the lockers. Tell them the children were asleep in bay. The line ended in white noise and a sound like a star breaking. When the audio cut, the silence afterward was worse than the sound had been. Minister Varkesh's scales had dulled. Chief Arbiter Sorath sat perfectly still. Too still. Miriam spoke softly. That was the part your commentators called emotional propaganda. No one answered. She brought up the final archive. This is why the court downgrade happened. The Holofield filled with cargo manifests. Financial transfers. Insurance packets. Mineral rights maps. At first the data looked incomprehensible. Then Miriam highlighted one region. 3 frontier moons in the Aster Verge. Small names. Unimportant systems. Little places hardly anyone in the hall had heard of. 4 months before Dawn's Mercy was destroyed, Carrot Extraction Guild seized labor populations in the Aster Verge under anti-piracy emergency powers. They called the camps security relocations. They were not relocations. They were mines. Human relief teams began pulling survivors. So did Scythian merchants. So did Rin observers. Dawn's Mercy carried evacuees from those camps. Some of them had testimony. Some had biometric proof of forced labor. Some had names. She expanded the data again. The names did not belong only to Carrot officers. Shipping consortium executives. Registry brokers. Customs supervisors. Insurance underwriters. 3 members of the Judicial Liaison Office. The chamber erupted. Not in laughter this time. In alarm. In shouted denials. In frantic transmission. In aides swarming their principals. In news drones abandoning decorum and diving forward for better angles. Security lights intensified. Somewhere a spectator fainted and tipped from a perch, saved only by an autonet snapping open beneath them. Chief Arbiter Sorath struck the gavel sphere again and again, but order is difficult to restore once truth begins naming shareholders. Minister Varkesh was the first to regain enough control to weaponize outrage. This is conspiracy theater, he snarled. A scatter of unrelated ledgers and forged routing seals assembled into a political attack on a sovereign dominion. The human petitioner seeks not justice but destabilization. Miriam turned to face him fully. Yes, she said. Justice is destabilizing to people built on impunity. A pulse of sound moved through the hall. Varkesh bared his teeth. Be careful, human. Of what? The minister spread both arms to include the bench, the chamber, the emblems of law itself. Of imagining your species can threaten the order that keeps the stars from tearing themselves apart. Miriam's gaze did not waver. The stars are not being torn apart by evidence. She touched her console once more. Now we reach the reason Earth waited. Another file opened. Not finance this time. Not even from Dawn's Mercy. A series of sealed communiques between Soul Relief, Pelagos Customs advocates, and the Hall of Final Petition over the 3 weeks following the destruction. Request after request. Petition after petition. Motion after motion. Human representatives asking for rec access. For survivor lists. For patrol weapon telemetry. For inspection of debris rights. For emergency preservation orders. Each delayed. Each rerouted. Each denied on procedural grounds so technical they almost became parody. The hall watched bureaucracy sharpen itself into a weapon. We waited, Miriam said, because we thought the system was damaged. We tried repair. We filed. We appealed. We complied with every instruction from every office that told us the proper path required patience. While we waited, debris rights were auctioned. Witnesses disappeared. Customs logs were scrubbed. Patrol crews were reassigned. And commentators laughed at us for still believing in law. Her voice remained measured. That was what made it dangerous. Earth did not come here because we are naive. Earth came here because we wanted the record to show what we did before we chose something else. Every species in the room understood escalation. Not all at once. Not the same way. But they felt the temperature change. Prelate Joran rumbled from the bench. Is that a threat? Miriam looked up. No. It is a timeline. That line would travel farther than any warship. Varkesh snapped at his aides. Two of them began transmitting furiously. Along the walls, security drones rotated toward the human section. Somewhere behind the bench, hidden doors opened with low hydraulic sighs. Chief Arbiter Soreth straightened. This tribunal will recess for internal review. All public transmission is suspended pending authenticity analysis. No, Miriam said. The word landed like a locked airlock. Soreth's pale eyes narrowed. You do not command this chamber. No, Miriam said again. But you no longer control the evidence. She expanded the mirror stamps. Every archive packet. Every verification chain. Every playback file. Already released. Already relayed to news guilds, neutral registries, merchant compacts, monastic vaults, civilian networks, refugee channels, naval observers, and 172 independent legal archives across the Concord. The public feed indicator glowed red. Live. Magistrate Helle whispered, not quite softly enough, by the skies. Miriam went on. This hearing was mirrored the moment it began. Every laugh. Every objection. Every attempt to bury this case a second time. For the first time that morning, fear touched the bench openly. Soreth's voice became dangerous in a colder way. Security. Seize the petitioner's console. Amber lights flashed brighter along the walls. Captain Mercer rose. He was an old man with one damaged leg, a civilian coat, and the posture of someone who had once walked through gunfire because someone smaller could not. He did not shout. He did not make threats. He simply stood beside the two children in the second row and placed one hand on the back of the nearest chair. The doctor in white opened his coat and revealed not a weapon but a second data core sealed in transparent polymer. The navigation officer with the scarred face did the same. Then the gray-haired refugee minister. Then the Scythian liaison. Then the Rin archivist. 8 people. 8 cores. Distributed memory. The chamber understood. Miriam said, we assumed confiscation. Security drones halted mid-advance, their command trees suddenly tangled in jurisdiction, optics, and the unpleasant possibility that any aggressive move would complete the human argument for them. Varkesh hissed through clenched teeth. You planned this spectacle. Miriam answered without heat. You planned the massacre. We prepared for the hearing. That was the moment public opinion across the live networks began to turn, though those inside the chamber did not yet know it. Comment streams that had mocked the humans froze and rewrote themselves. Merchant analysts began asking very precise questions about insurance exposure. Frontier governors demanded names from the ledgers. Refugee communities lit memorial beacons across 7 systems. Naval observers started comparing the Carrot Patrol commander's voiceprint against active service rosters. In the hall, the collapse had not yet finished. It had only begun. Chief Arbiter Soreth tried a different angle. Even if this archive is genuine, he said, it proves misconduct by patrol officers and perhaps corruption in subordinate administrative offices. It does not justify the insinuations you make against this bench or the inflammatory rhetoric with which you threaten interstellar stability. Miriam inclined her head slightly. Respectful. Deadly. You are correct. The black box alone would not. She activated the final sequence. The chamber screens filled with a star map of the Pelagos corridor. Civilian routes in blue. Customs checkpoints in white. Carried patrols in red. Then gold marks appeared farther out, at first faint, then in numbers large enough to force the eye to widen. Ships. Dozens. Then hundreds. Hospital ships. Rescue tugs. Relief carriers. Escort destroyers. Scythian convoy tenders. Rin sanctuary barges. Independent merchant hulls under temporary sole charter. A vast ring of waiting vessels positioned just outside legal intervention range. Varkesh stared. What is this? The part Earth did not discuss publicly, Miriam said. While we filed motions, we also searched. She enlarged the map. Small emergency pings bloomed amid the debris fields, asteroid shadows, abandoned cargo pods, and unregistered holding stations scattered through carrier-controlled space. Dawn's Mercy was not the only transport intercepted. It was the one you destroyed so openly you assumed terror would protect you. We followed its deadman burst. We found signal echoes. We found jammed beacons. We found life support signatures in impound hulks and quarantine depots and false customs yards. We found 6,203 survivors from other missing transports. No one spoke. Some were children. Some were labor prisoners. Some were witnesses from the Aster Verge camps. Some were carried civilians whose families could not pay seizure fines. All waiting in places never entered into any lawful registry. Minister Varkesh took one involuntary step backward. Miriam kept going. Earth requested warrants. This court delayed. Earth requested inspection authority. This court delayed. Earth requested refugee intervention. This court delayed. So Earth assembled a rescue coalition under the emergency civilian protection clauses your own system pretended were too complicated to implement. They are not too complicated. You were simply relying on no one reading the fine print. A low sound rolled through the galleries, part awe, part fear. The fleet you see on this map, Miriam said, has been holding position for 19 hours. Prelate Joran's ridged face darkened. You moved armed forces into Concord transit without sanction. No, said Miriam. We moved hospitals with escorts. That was more frightening. Because every species in the hull knew what it meant when humans called something an escort. Humans had a cultural habit that unnerved older powers. They built compassion with hard edges. Their hospital ships were always near capable fleets. Their refugee corridors had redundancy, logistics, med support, and contingency firepower hidden under the quiet language of relief. Their civilians had a way of surviving in shapes that looked suspiciously like strategy. Miriam placed both hands on the console. 32 minutes ago, after verifying the black box archive against neutral chain of custody standards, coalition rescue elements entered the first 6 holding sites. 15 minutes ago, they entered 17 more. 4 minutes ago, they detained the Carrot border commander whose voice you heard on the recording. As of now, 112 surviving witnesses from the Aster Verge camps are under medical protection and transmitting testimony. Varkesh opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. You had no authority. Miriam's voice sharpened for the first time. We had children in cages. The chamber recoiled as if struck. Then she mastered the edge and brought it back down. We asked for authority. You laughed. No one on the bench had any answer to that. Chief Arbiter Sorath reached for dignity because it was the only weapon still near to hand. If your coalition has engaged in unauthorized operations in sovereign Carrot space, then regardless of the original incident, you may have triggered a cross-border crisis of immense scale. Miriam looked up at him with an expression so controlled it felt almost mournful. Chief Arbiter, the crisis was triggered when a court relay downgraded a refugee SEAL and a patrol commander said, "Too late," after protection activated. What you are witnessing now is response. The distinction broke something in the room. Not legally. Morally. Because law can survive corruption longer than legitimacy can survive clarity. Soreth turned to confer with the other benches, but they were already conferring in frantic private bursts. Clerks moved. Seals were checked. One bench member began transmitting out of band to a personal contact and was stopped by a security auditor whose loyalty had evidently shifted with the public feed. Miriam did not let the tempo drop. "Earth is not asking today whether Dawn's mercy was a tragedy," she said. "That answer was in the black box before any of us entered this room. Earth is asking whether this tribunal wishes to remain relevant. That got their attention in a way outrage had not. Because empires can weather scandal. Courts cannot weather irrelevance. If this hall acts now," she continued, "it can still claim it corrected itself under exposure. It can issue warrants. Freeze accounts. Strip immunity from named conspirators. Recognize the survivors recovered this morning. Restore corridor protections across the verge. Convene independent review of every missing transport routed through Pelagos over the past 18 months. If this hall refuses..." She did not finish immediately. She let them imagine the rest. Humans understood silence too. "Then the rescue coalition will proceed without you, and every frontier world now watching will understand exactly what your judgments are worth." That was not bravado. That was market pressure, military pressure, moral pressure, and narrative pressure bound into one simple future. Varkesh lashed his tail once against the floor. "The Dominion will regard any detention of its officers as piracy." A new voice answered him. Not Miriam's. Captain Elias Mercer stepped forward at last. Old spine straight. One hand still near the children's chairs. "Then you should have behaved like a government instead of a raiding party." The gallery turned toward him. He was not scheduled to speak. That made it stronger. Mercer's face was lined deeply, not by politics but by service and loss and years spent lifting the frightened with hands that had long ago learned how much a body weighs when it stops helping. He looked at Varkesh not with hatred, but with something more unsettling. Recognition. "I was there after Haven Glass," he said. "I helped open transports where the doors had fused and the air had gone sour. I carried a boy with Scythian lungs through a corridor full of steam because his mother had already been dead too long to let go of him. I watched human nurses teach carried toddlers how to breathe through smoke hoods because the adults around them were too injured to stand." He pointed one shaking finger toward the recorder corps. "That ship was full of the same kind of people. Not soldiers. People. And your officers knew it." Varkesh sneered, but not convincingly. Mercer went on. "You think humans are dangerous because of our fleets. Because of our engines. Because sometimes we smile while calculating exactly how many ways a war can end. That isn't what makes us dangerous." His voice dropped. "What makes us dangerous is that once we decide someone is under our protection, we do not become reasonable about them." No one in the chamber interrupted. "We file first," Mercer said. "We ask. We negotiate. We offer exchanges, corridors, audits, observers, inspectors, compromises, and second chances because we know what force costs. But if you mistake that for weakness, if you use our patience as a countdown while you hurt civilians, if you fire on children and then laugh in a courtroom, you do not get the version of humanity that wants to be liked." The two children behind him were staring at the floor now. The carried infant in the recovered footage had not been in that room, but somehow every species felt present all at once. Mercer looked up at the bench. "You get the version that keeps records." That line settled over everything. Miriam did not thank him. She did not need to. The script of the morning had already escaped everyone who thought they controlled it. Chief Arbiter Soreth conferred again with the other benches, this time openly desperate. Some wanted adjournment. Some wanted partial concessions. Some wanted to sacrifice lower officials and save the institution. Some wanted to call in security anyway and pray control could be reasserted before public outrage hardened into realignment. While they argued, news arrived in fragments. One Carrot patrol station had surrendered without resistance after coalition medships broadcast the black box audio on open channel. A frontier customs office had released 23 impounded miners and requested asylum. 3 shipping insurers had frozen Dominion liability coverage pending fraud review. The Scythian Trade Assembly was considering emergency suspension of Carrot cargo preference. The Rin monastic courts had declared the dead of Dawn's mercy witnessed and entered into sanctified memory, which in frontier regions carried more practical force than many treaties. And most dangerous of all, smaller species across the Concord were beginning to speak. Not because they suddenly loved humans. But because once the strongest lie in the room fractures, everyone the lie had been sitting on begins to breathe. Soreth finally raised both hands. By temporary authority of the central bench pending emergency review, he said, voice tight, this tribunal orders the immediate detention of named Carrot Border Command officers present in the black box evidence, provisional freeze of associated transit accounts, and sealing of all Pelagos customs archives under independent audit. The chamber exhaled. It was not enough. Everyone knew it. Miriam knew it too. She did not smile. Soreth continued, choosing each word like it might bite him. This tribunal further recognizes emergency protected status for all survivors recovered in the coalition rescue operation and authorizes a neutral commission to. Too small, Miriam said. You could feel the shock run through the room. People were not accustomed to interrupting the 9 benches after they began to bend. Chief Arbiter Soreth's face turned almost colorless. Advocate. Too small, she repeated. You are still drafting for reputational weather. This is not weather. This is climate. The phrase would be quoted in legal academies for decades. She expanded the names list again, all the way upward. Liaison officers. Financial brokers. Registry clerks. 2 dead judges. 3 living advisors. And 1 current senior administrator whose office sat less than 60 meters from the chamber. A side door near the clerk's wing slid open as security finally realized what she was doing. Too late. The administrator ran. He made it 9 steps before chamber drones intercepted him in full view of every live feed. That ended the last argument about whether the rot was theoretical. Soreth closed his eyes for 1 long second. When he opened them, something in him had changed. Not morality. Necessity. Expand the detentions, he said quietly. Clerk stared. Expand them now. Orders rippled outward. In the Carrot delegation tier, aides tried to leave and found exits sealed. Minister Varkesh looked suddenly older, as though arrogance had been scaffolding and someone had kicked it out from under him. 2 Concord security teams in matte gray moved toward the Dominion section. They did not hurry. They did not need to. The rest of the hearing unfolded with the terrible efficiency institutions sometimes discover only once survival depends on honesty they should have chosen earlier. Warrants multiplied. Accounts froze. Customs nodes were locked. Emergency corridor status was restored retroactively across disputed lanes. Search mandates went out to 61 missing transport cases previously buried under anti-piracy classifications. Neutral observers were assigned. Independent medships cleared entry. Bench liaisons resigned in real time. One tried to delete files and instead triggered an automated public archive mirror written, to everyone's growing irritation, by human systems engineers. That, more than any speech, convinced some of the older species that humanity had never really been pleading. It had been setting pins. Miriam answered questions for 2 more hours. Always concise. Never theatrical. She walked the court through timestamps, routing chains, survivorship probabilities, rescue protocols, witness handling, casualty projections, and the legal basis for coalition intervention. Every answer had 3 layers: moral clarity for the public, technical precision for the clerks, and quiet warning for anyone still considering resistance. By the time the final recess was called, the laughter from the morning felt like something obscene dug out of a ruin. Outside the hall, Kepri Prime was waking into chaos. Crowds had gathered beneath the judicial ring, not violent yet, but dense enough to change traffic patterns for kilometers. Screens replayed the audio of Dawn's mercy over city plazas, port bars, hospital lobbies, freight depots, and chapel walls. Species that had once rolled their eyes at human grief now listened with the expression of people counting their own children. At Pelagos, the customs gate chief who had tried 3 times to validate Dawn's mercy before the downgrade took effect came forward publicly and surrendered his archives. On Aster Verge mining moons, workers struck and barricaded equipment yards. In the Scythian ports, stevedores refused carried priority loading. On neutral channels, ship captains began swapping safe corridor updates tagged with a new informal phrase that no office had authorized. Witness us. Human fleets did not fire a shot that day. They did not need to. Their hospital ships cut docking queues across 3 sectors because suddenly every minor species with half a fear and an old missing cousin wanted medical scans, transport review, and verification that their names had not been quietly deleted from a system somewhere. Human legal offices were flooded with messages. So were human embassies. So were human navy relays, which was unfortunate for admirals who preferred predictable paperwork. But perhaps the clearest measure of what had changed came from the smallest places. At a school station in the Varan Drift, teachers paused lessons so children from 12 species could listen to a recording of Captain Ortez telling frightened passengers they would be found. At a frontier shrine, the names of Dawn's mercy dead were projected beside the names of the living rescued from the hidden depots. At a carrot agricultural moon far from any battlefield, a mother who had believed her seized daughter dead saw her face on a coalition rescue roster and collapsed into a field row laughing and sobbing at once. Law had failed them first. But humanity had not left them there. That was the part the old powers had never fully understood. Empires believed in first strikes, first claims, first declarations. Courts believed in first jurisdiction. Markets believed in first access. But humans, for all their noise and grief and inconvenient attachment to individual lives, had built an entire civilization around a different instinct. Not first possession. First return. If a name had been taken, humans tried to return it. If a child had been buried in paperwork, humans tried to return her to the people still saying that name in the dark. If a ship had vanished under classifications and denials and legal phrasing so sterile it no longer sounded like blood, humans tried to return the truth with enough weight that no one could file it away again. By midday on Kepri Prime, that instinct had become policy. By evening, it had become momentum. By the next dawn, it had become the most dangerous thing in the Concord. Not a fleet. Not a sanction. Not even a tribunal finally forced to remember what justice was supposed to look like. A pattern. Because once the hidden depots began opening, the pattern emerged faster than even Miriam Vale had predicted. The first holding station was found inside the shell of an abandoned customs spine 300,000 kilometers above Pelagos Minor, its registry marked inactive 14 years earlier after a reactor coolant fire that records now showed had never happened. The second lay beneath a bonded freight platform in the Verge, its power masked by falsified thermal bleed. The third was not even hidden well. It had been listed openly as an agricultural quarantine annex because no one in authority had ever expected anyone to investigate missing civilians with military-grade patience. Human rescue crews entered all 3 within 6 hours. Then 7 more. Then 11. By the time the Concord's emergency auditors began catching up to the route chains Earth had already mapped in silence over the previous month, the number of recovered civilians had passed 4,000. That figure broke people in a way statistics usually did not. Because 4,000 was too large for anecdote and too personal for abstraction. It was no longer one ship. No longer one corridor. No longer one ugly hearing and one arrogant minister caught smiling in the wrong century of history. It was infrastructure. The kind that only exists when enough officials, enough brokers, enough border officers, enough clerks, enough insurers, enough neutral observers, and enough polite institutions all decide at once that the disappeared are easier to manage than the found. Across the Concord, every office that had ever filed a complaint under non-priority civilian irregularity suddenly discovered the terror of being searchable. At 2:13 station time, Pelago's command attempted to purge archival relay mirrors. The command bounced. Human systems engineers had seeded redundant public ledgers through freight arbitration networks, monastic record vaults, medship logistics chains, and 3 university libraries so obscure that one of the carried counterintelligence officers assigned to wipe them reportedly asked if the RIN even had electricity. They did. They also had memory. And now memory had gone public. On the second day, Chief Arbiter Sorath reconvened the Hall of Final Petition under Emergency Preservation Doctrine. The chamber was even fuller than before, though the atmosphere had changed so completely it felt like a different civilization had rented the same architecture overnight. The laughter was gone. So was much of the certainty. Minister Varkesh did not appear in ceremonial crimson this time. He entered between 2 gray-armored Concord security officers, wrists bound by a restraint field that glowed pale around his scaled forearms. His delegation tier stood half empty. 3 aides had already entered protective custody. 1 had vanished. Another had transmitted a request for asylum to a human legal relay using the sort of panicked phrasing that suggested he had spent most of his professional life assuming asylum was something that happened to lesser beings. Miriam Vale stood where she had stood before. Same platform. Same dark suit. Same measured expression. But the geometry of power had shifted around her. Now when she touched the console, benches leaned forward. Now when translators rendered her voice across 100 species, people did not hear a petitioner. They heard an update. The verified survivor count is now 4,312, she said. Projected live recoveries remain ongoing. Evidence recovered from the stations confirms integrated trafficking, coercive labor assignment, biometric identity suppression, child separation, and selective data deletion across at least 9 jurisdictions. No one interrupted. Of those recovered, Miriam continued, 1,106 are minors. 347 were officially recorded as dead. 819 were never entered into any recognized registry at all. That landed harder than the rest. Never entered. There are crimes of violence, and then there are crimes of erasure. Older species feared the second more. The first leaves ruins. The second leaves clean floors. A clerk to Soratha's right looked physically ill. Magistrate Hellay no longer shone. Her feathers sat flat and dull against her neck. Prelate Joran kept flexing one plated hand against the bench as though his body had not yet decided whether it wanted to fight, flee, or disassociate into procedural language. Sorath spoke without ceremony. Advocate Vale. Does Earth allege the Dominion acted alone? Miriam did not answer quickly. That frightened them more than if she had. Earth alleges, she said at last, that the Dominion built the largest share of the mechanism. Earth also alleges the mechanism survived because too many others found it administratively useful. A murmur moved through the chamber like static over old metal. Then she began naming them. Not recklessly. Not theatrically. System by system. Bureau by bureau. Transit partners who downgraded distress lanes after premium disputes. Inspection boards that accepted impossible maintenance reports. Banking consortia that profited from unclaimed identity pools. Insurance structures designed so that the disappearance of poor civilians cost less than their transport. Observers who had visited facilities, noticed discrepancies, and filed them under ambiguity because ambiguity kept trade moving. The genius of the accusation was that it was not moralistic. It was structural. Humans were not merely saying, "You are cruel." Humans were saying, "You built this because it paid." That made denial much harder. Especially because every claim came attached to logs, timestamps, mirrored contracts, recovered testimony, and black box-derived route correlations that human analysts had been quietly building while the rest of the Concord assumed grief had made Earth irrational. Grief had not made Earth irrational. It had made Earth thorough. By the close of that second session, 7 emergency commercial blocks had suspended carried freight privileges. 2 border admirals publicly refused to execute seizure orders without independent civilian verification. A mutual defense counsel on the outer verge issued the sort of careful statement that diplomats use when they know history is watching but are still hoping not to be quoted too harshly. And somewhere inside all of it, a different realization began to spread. Humanity had not mobilized for revenge. That was what unnerved the galaxy most. If this had only been rage, older powers would have understood it. Rage burns hot, announces itself, and eventually runs out of fuel. Empires survive rage all the time. They count on it. But this was rescue weaponized by evidence. This was compassion coordinated at military scale. This was humanity taking the oldest thing in itself, that stubborn refusal to abandon the endangered, and bolting it to logistics, law, signal intelligence, and fleet positioning until even the most cynical species in the Concord had to accept a fact they had spent decades mocking. Mercy, in human hands, was not softness. It was reach. At Pelagos, the Dominion cruiser Severance Edict received orders on the third morning to interdict a convoy of coalition medships approaching one of the recovered satellite depots. Captain Dresk of the edict was carried to the bone. 28 years in service. Border purges. Colonial actions. Anti-piracy sweeps so loose in definition they had become profitable. He had once described human diplomacy as war in a hospital uniform. He listened to the order. He looked at the firing solution. He requested confirmation. What came back was a threat. Execute, or be relieved. Then his calm officer, who had a sister working freight adjudication on a neutral moon, sent him a contraband packet under private channel. Not text. Not legal analysis. Audio. Captain Ortez on the bridge of Dawn's Mercy, voice steady over failing systems, telling passengers to stay low, keep the children away from the venting corridor, preserve suit oxygen, trust the beacon, trust the record, trust that someone would come. Dresk listened once. Then again. Then he looked through the forward display at the approaching medships marked in white and blue under coalition protection, their hulls lit clean against the dark. No guns extended. No strike screens raised. Only rescue signatures, casualty capacity, and a legal authority bundle so comprehensive it would take his clerk 16 hours to read. He powered down weapons and stood his bridge to silence. Log refusal, he said. His first officer stared. Dresk did not raise his voice. Log refusal under command conscience. Then clear the lane. But sir. Clear the lane. The Severance Edict rolled 10 degrees starboard and opened the corridor. That single maneuver crossed 1,000 channels before the hour was out. A carried warship yielding not to superior firepower, but to the moral weight of a recording. To older species, it looked like weakness. To frontier worlds, it looked like the first honest decision anyone in uniform had made in months. To humans, it looked familiar. Because they had always known that somewhere inside every system, however rotten, there were still individuals waiting for a moment when decency became logistically possible. Earth specialized in creating those moments. Not because humans were cleaner than everyone else. They were not. History argued otherwise in many languages. But humans had one trait the Concord kept underestimating. Once ashamed, they tended to build tools to prevent repetition. And those tools were now everywhere. Mirror archives. Witness relays. Civilian convoy meshes. Open custody ledgers. Refugee verification chains. Emergency child location protocols. Portable court packages. Hospital ships with legal staff aboard. The galaxy had laughed at human redundancy for years. Too many backups. Too many safeguards. Too many signatures. Too many medics, too many observers, too many recordings, too many sentimental little practices built around names and kinship and chain of custody. Until the day those sentimental practices started opening prison doors across 9 jurisdictions. That afternoon, Captain Elias Mercer finally left the hull. Not because the work was done. Because more of it now existed than one old man could help in person. He descended through layers of reporters, drones, and security cordons until he reached the lower transit concourse where rescue manifests were being updated in real time on public walls. People stood 3 and 4 rows deep beneath the projections. Some crying. Some silent. Some just staring at names as though motion itself had become disrespectful. Mercer moved slowly along the screens. A little Varan girl wearing a borrowed station coat stood on tiptoe near the 3rd column, her translation band flickering as it tried to keep pace with her breathing. She pointed to a recovered name list with both hands. "That one," she whispered to the exhausted human nurse beside her. "That one is my brother." The nurse looked. Checked twice. Then crouched to eye level. "Yes," she said. "That one is your brother." The girl did not cheer. She folded inward first, as though the body had to survive the truth before it could feel it. Then she grabbed the nurse around the neck and began making the terrible, relieved sound of someone who had been brave longer than childhood was supposed to allow. Mercer turned away for 1 second. Only one. When he looked back, there were others already moving to help. Human. Non-human. Uniformed. Civilian. Species that had been taught not to trust one another suddenly sharing tablets, translation bands, manifests, water, space, names. That was how orders really collapsed. Not always under bombardment. Sometimes under recognition. By the end of the week, 61 missing transport cases had been reopened. By the end of the month, 17 officials from 4 species were under tribunal indictment, 3 commercial compacts had been rewritten, and corridor protection law had expanded farther in 30 days than reformers had managed in the previous 80 years. But the deepest change did not enter law first. It entered language. Because all across the Concord, in freight lanes and school stations and customs docks and refugee chapels and Navy mess halls where people pretended not to care about politics, a new phrase had begun surviving the week. Not believe humans. Not fear humans. Not even trust humans. Something simpler. If they are recording, stop lying. That was the lesson empires took from Kepri Prime. The lesson smaller worlds took was different. If humans say they are still looking, do not bury hope yet. Years later, scholars would argue over when the old Concord truly began to fracture. Some would point to trade sanctions. Some to the black box hearing. Some to the public archives. Some to the moment a carried cruiser opened a humanitarian lane rather than fire. They were all wrong. The fracture had begun much earlier. In the instant powerful people laughed at a woman standing alone on a smaller platform because she said Earth had brought a black box. They thought it was just evidence. They thought it was grief, packaged. They thought it was one more human attempt to make the galaxy feel guilty enough to behave. They did not understand what humans actually carry when they bring a record into a room. Not sound. Not data. Not even proof. Witness. And witness, once opened, is very hard to kill. Because fleets can be resisted. Courts can be corrupted. Markets can be bribed. But a truth carried far enough, by enough hands, into enough systems, eventually becomes heavier than the people who tried to bury it. That was the real verdict of Kepri Prime. Law had failed them first. But humanity had arrived second. And in that part of the galaxy, everyone learned the same thing at last. If humans ever come to your door carrying the black box, pray you were the one who tried to save the children. Because if you were not, they will not only find out. They will make sure the whole galaxy does.